I was a new hire at the law firm. I stayed late to help a janitor fix the copy machine. He turned out to be the senior partner's brother. The senior partner fired me at 9:47 a.m. on a Wednesday, not for helping his brother, for what I found while helping his brother. The difference matters, legally speaking, which is ironic considering what Lawrence Templeton spent 30 years teaching associates about the law. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the night I stayed late to fix a copy machine with a man I thought was just the janitor. His name was Dennis Templeton, though I didn't know the last name for 3 weeks. I just knew him as Dennis, the night custodian who asked too many questions about contracts and smiled like he was in on a joke nobody else understood. I'd been at Templeton and Sterling for exactly 2 months when I first met Dennis. The firm occupied floors 12 through 15 of the Garrison building downtown, all glass and steel and the kind of expensive minimalism that screamed old money trying to look modern. I was 26, fresh out of law school with loans that made my stomach hurt, and a salary that barely covered a studio apartment in a neighborhood where I heard gunshots twice a week. But it was Templeton and Sterling. You didn't turn down Templeton and Sterling. The firm handled corporate acquisitions, patent litigation, estate planning, for the kind of families who had portraits of their ancestors in the Smithsonian. Lawrence Templeton himself had argued before the Supreme Court. Twice, won both times. The man was a legend, the kind of lawyer other lawyers studied. I was assigned to his division, corporate acquisitions, working under a senior associate named Philip Greaves, who had the personality of a stapler and the empathy of a parking meter. My typical day started at 7 a.m. and ended whenever Philip decided it ended, which was usually around 9 p.m., sometimes later. I reviewed contracts, researched case law, drafted memos that Philip would mark up with red ink like he was grading a failing student's exam, then redrafted them. The work was tedious, exhausting, and exactly what I'd signed up for. You paid your dues as a junior associate. Everyone knew that. You worked the ungodly hours. You ate cold pizza at your desk. You sacrificed your 20s so that maybe, possibly, in 10 years, you'd make partner, and it would all be worth it. That was the deal. I met Dennis on a Thursday in October, around 10:30 at night. Most people had gone home. The support staff left at 6. The senior partners usually cleared out by 8, unless they had a major deal closing. Only the junior associates stayed late, scattered across the 14th floor like prisoners in well-lit cells. I was making copies of a 300-page contract, standing at the massive printer-copier scanner machine that probably cost more than my car, when it jammed. Not just a normal jam where you open the drawer and pull out the crumpled page. This was a catastrophic jam, the kind where the machine started making angry beeping sounds and flashing error codes I'd never seen before. I tried the obvious fixes, turned it off and on, opened every drawer and panel I could find. Nothing worked. The thing just kept beeping at me like I'd personally offended it. I was standing there, seriously considering kicking it, when a voice behind me said, "You're going about that wrong." I turned around and saw an older man, maybe mid-60s, wearing navy blue coveralls and pushing a cleaning cart. He had gray hair that needed a trim, deep lines around his eyes, and this expression like he'd seen people struggle with this exact machine 1,000 times before. Quote 1, he said, walking over. Quote 2, he didn't wait for permission, just moved past me and started opening panels I hadn't known existed. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd fixed this machine many times before, reaching into the guts of it and pulling out a mangled piece of paper from a compartment I never would have found. The machine stopped beeping immediately. "There you go," he said, closing the panels. "Should work fine now. Just remember, no more than 200 sheets at a time in the main tray. If you need to copy something longer, use the bypass tray on the left side." I stared at him. "How do you know which desk I have?" He smiled, and there was something knowing in it, something that made me feel like I was missing the punchline. "I clean it every night. You're the one who leaves coffee rings on the coaster instead of on the desk. I appreciate that." "Oh, right. Thank you. I'm Michael, by the way. Michael Reeves." I extended my hand and he shook it. His grip was firm, calloused, the kind of hand that had done physical work for decades. "Dennis," he said, "nice to meet you officially." He started to push his cart away, but I said, "Wait, seriously, thank you. I would have been here until midnight trying to figure that out." Dennis stopped and turned back. "You're here until midnight anyway, aren't you?" It wasn't really a question. He gestured at my desk, visible through the glass walls, buried under stacks of paper and sticky notes. I felt a little uncomfortable that he'd been reading the materials on my desk, but I couldn't exactly say that to the janitor. Quote 13, quote 14, Dennis said, and something in the way he said the name made me pause. Not Mr. Templeton, not the senior partner, just Lawrence, casual and familiar. I asked. Dennis's expression shifted, became carefully neutral in a way that made me more curious. I've worked in this building a long time. I know everyone. That wasn't really an answer, but before I could press, he said, quote 17, and walked away, pushing his cart down the hallway toward the next office. I watched him go, feeling like I just had a conversation with two meanings, only understanding one of them. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing Dennis more. He was always there late at night, usually around 10 or 11, emptying trash cans and vacuuming the common areas. Sometimes I'd see him in the break room restocking supplies or in the copy room fixing whatever machine had broken that day. We'd exchange greetings, sometimes small talk about the weather or the building's terrible heating system. He asked questions about my work, not in a nosy way, but like he was genuinely interested in the cases I was researching. I found myself looking forward to those brief conversations honestly. Everyone else at the firm treated me like I was invisible or slightly incompetent. Dennis treated me like a person. It was Dennis who showed me where Philip hid the good coffee, the expensive imported stuff the partners kept for clients. Quote 18. Dennis said, grinning like a conspirator. Quote 19. He told me which copy machine was most reliable, which bathroom on which floor had the best water pressure, which conference room had the comfortable chairs that didn't make your back hurt during long meetings. Small things, but they made the job more bearable. Then one night in early November, about 3 months into my time at the firm, I was working late on a contract dispute case when I heard a crash from the copy room. I went to investigate and found Dennis standing next to the big machine, looking frustrated. The side panel was open, and there were pieces of plastic and metal scattered on the floor. Everything okay? I asked. Dennis looked up, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely upset. I offered. He hesitated, then nodded. Quote 23. We spent the next hour on the floor next to that copy machine, trying to figure out how the internal mechanism fit back together. Dennis had a surprising amount of knowledge about the machine's engineering, talking about feed rollers and fuser assemblies like he'd designed the thing himself. At one point, I asked him how he knew so much about copy machines. He said, focused on a particularly stubborn screw. There was weight in those two words. Different life, like he was talking about more than just a career change. I wanted to ask what happened, what brought a man who clearly understood complex machinery to cleaning office buildings at night, but it felt too personal. We got the machine working again around 1 a.m. Dennis stood up, dusting off his coveralls, and looked at the copier with satisfaction. I said. Dennis laughed, and then he did something unexpected. He pulled out a small flask from his coverall pocket and offered it to me. I probably shouldn't have. I was technically still on the clock, and drinking with the custodial staff at 1 a.m. wasn't exactly professional, but something about the moment felt right, felt human in a way nothing else at this firm did. So I took the flask and had a sip. It was good whiskey, really good, the kind that costs $200 a bottle. I must have made a face because Dennis grinned. Quote 30. He said, taking the flask back and having a drink himself. We sat on the floor next to the copy machine, passing the flask back and forth, and Dennis started talking, really talking. He told me about growing up in Pennsylvania, about his father who'd been a factory worker and his mother who'd taught piano. He talked about going to college, getting a degree in mechanical engineering, working for manufacturing companies in the 80s and 90s. Quote 31, he said, staring at the ceiling. Quote 32, quote 33, I asked, and immediately regretted it because his expression darkened. Quote 34. Dennis said, and there was old bitterness in his voice. Quote 35. I nodded, not sure where this was going. Dennis took another drink. I felt something cold settle in my stomach because I knew where this story was going. I'd seen enough estate cases in law school to know what came next. He took it, I said quietly. Dennis nodded. Not all at once. Not obviously, but bit by bit, over about 5 years, he used his position to redirect assets, convinced our mother, who was already declining mentally, to sign things she didn't understand. Used legal maneuvers I couldn't fight because I couldn't afford lawyers as good as him. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd been systematically cut out of everything. The family business shares went to him. The property got sold, and somehow all the proceeds went to paying estate debts that didn't exist. My father's life insurance policy that had me as co-beneficiary got changed. All perfectly legal, all documented, all by a lawyer who knew exactly how to steal from his own brother and make it look legitimate. The whiskey tasted sour in my mouth. Did you try to fight it? With what? Dennis laughed bitterly. I hired a lawyer, spent what savings I had, got nowhere. My brother had better lawyers, better connections. He dragged it out until I couldn't afford to keep fighting. Lost my house paying legal fees for a case I couldn't win. I'm sorry, I said, because what else do you say to something like that? Dennis waved it off. Ancient history, 20 years ago now. Lost the house, lost my wife in the divorce that followed, lost my career because I was too depressed and angry to function. Spent some years bouncing around, drinking too much, working whatever jobs I could find. Eventually ended up here, cleaning offices at night because at least it's steady work and nobody asks questions. We sat in silence for a moment, and I was processing what he'd told me. This entire tragedy condensed into a 10-minute conversation on the floor of a copy room. Then something occurred to me. Quote 44, I said slowly. Quote 45. He looked at me, and I saw the answer in his eyes before he said it. Quote 46. The flask slipped from my hand, hit the carpet with a soft thud. Quote 47. Quote 48. Dennis said, picking up the flask. Quote 49. My mind was racing. Lawrence Templeton, the senior partner, the legend, the man whose name was on the building, had stolen his brother's inheritance and left him working as a janitor in the same building where he practiced law. The irony was grotesque. The cruelty was stunning. Does he know you work here? I asked. Dennis smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. I didn't know what it was. Revenge? Masochism? Both? Dennis stood up, offered me a hand, pulled me to my feet. You're wondering why I'm telling you all this. Why I'm telling a junior associate at my brother's firm about how he destroyed my life. I nodded because I was absolutely wondering that. Because you're a good kid, Dennis said. Because you stayed late to help me fix a copy machine when you didn't have to. Because you treat me like a person instead of furniture. And because I think you're one of the few people at this firm who might actually give a damn about doing the right thing. He pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges like he'd been carrying it for a while. I took the paper, unfolded it. It was a handwritten list of document names, dates, case numbers. Estate of Richard Templeton, Templeton Family Trust, Pennsylvania property transfers, life insurance policy modifications. The list went on, maybe 20 items total. I asked. Dennis said. I said because we needed to be clear about what he was asking. Quote 61. Quote 62. Dennis corrected. Quote 63. I looked at the list, then at Dennis, then back at the list. Every logical part of my brain was screaming to hand the paper back, to walk away, to forget this conversation ever happened. I had student loans. I had a career to build. I had no business getting involved in a 20-year-old family dispute, especially one involving the most powerful lawyer in the state. But I kept thinking about Dennis sitting in the copy room at 1 a.m., fixing machines and emptying trash cans while his brother's name hung in gold letters on the office doors one floor above. I thought about estate law, about the sacred duty of executors, about how many times I'd heard Lawrence Templeton lecture about legal ethics and professional responsibility. Quote 64, I heard myself say. Quote 65. The relief on Dennis's face was immediate and profound. Thank you. Jesus, Michael, thank you. He grabbed my hand and shook it hard. I know it's a lot to ask. I know, but thank you. That night, I went home and couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I'd agreed to, about what it would mean if I actually found something. Around 3 a.m., I pulled out my laptop and started researching. Estate law in Pennsylvania 20 years ago, executor responsibilities, professional ethics violations, what I'd need to prove fraud. It was a rabbit hole, and I fell deep into it. The next morning, Friday, I came into work early, 7 a.m., before most people arrived. I used my access card to get into the file archives, the massive room on floor 13, where the firm kept physical copies of old cases. Everything was digitized now, but the physical files still existed, organized by year and case number. I found the section for estates from 20 years ago and started looking. Estate of Richard Templeton. The file was thick, maybe 4 inches of documents. I pulled it from the shelf, carried it to one of the research desks, and started reading. The initial documents were standard. Richard Templeton, deceased, survived by his wife Clara Templeton, and 2 sons, Lawrence and Dennis. Estate valued at approximately $1.2 million, which in the early 2000s was substantial. Included the family home, some commercial property, shares in a small manufacturing business, life insurance, and various investments. Lawrence had been named executor. I read through page after page of legal documents, most of it standard estate processing. Then I started noticing things. Small things at first, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. A property sale that happened remarkably fast, just 3 months after Richard's death, sold to an LLC I didn't recognize. The proceeds listed as going to pay estate debts, but when I looked at the debt documentation, the numbers didn't quite add up. The debts totaled maybe $200,000. The property sold for $450. Where did the extra $250,000 go? I made notes, kept reading. The family business shares were more complicated. Richard had owned 40% of a manufacturing company called Templeton Sterling Industrial. The name Sterling rang a bell because it was the other name on our firm's letterhead. I pulled out my phone, searched for the company, and found articles from 25 years ago. Templeton Sterling Industrial had been a mid-sized manufacturing firm in Pennsylvania, specializing in automotive parts. Founded by Richard Templeton and a man named Harold Sterling, they'd been business partners for 30 years. The company was eventually sold in the mid-2000s for a substantial amount. According to the estate documents, Richard's 40% share was valued at $200,000 at the time of his death. That seemed low, even for early 2000s valuation. I kept digging and found the appraisal report. It had been done by a company called Greenfield Associates. I wrote down the name. The business shares were supposed to be split between Lawrence and Dennis, 20% each. But according to the final estate distribution, Lawrence had received the full 40%. The documentation cited a previous agreement where Dennis had supposedly waived his rights to the business shares in exchange for a larger portion of the liquid assets. I paged through until I found the agreement. It was dated 2 years before Richard's death, notarized and signed by Dennis Templeton. The signature looked right, but something about the document felt off. The language was overly formal, even for a legal agreement, like someone had tried very hard to make it sound legitimate. I took photos of the agreement with my phone, careful to make sure I captured every detail, including the notary stamp. Then I kept reading. The life insurance policy was next. Richard had a policy for $500,000, split between his wife Clara and his 2 sons. Standard beneficiary designation, 50% to Clara, 25% to Lawrence, 25% to Dennis. Except there was a modification dated 3 months before Richard's death, a form changing the beneficiary split to 75% Clara, 25% Lawrence, 0% Dennis. The form had Clara's signature on it, and Dennis's signature acknowledging the change. I stared at that document for a long time. 3 months before death. That timing was suspicious. People don't usually modify life insurance beneficiaries unless they have a reason, unless they know something is coming. I photographed it too, then kept going through the file. By 9 a.m., I'd gone through the entire estate file and had a phone full of photos and a head full of questions. None of what I'd found was smoking gun proof of fraud. Not yet, but there were enough inconsistencies to make me deeply uncomfortable. I returned the file to the archives and went to my desk, trying to act normal even though my heart was racing. Philip showed up around 9:30 and immediately dumped more work on me, something about a merger agreement that needed review by Monday. I nodded, said I'd get it done, and spent the whole day pretending to work on it while actually researching Greenfield Associates, the appraisal company. Greenfield Associates no longer existed. The company had dissolved in 2007, about 2 years after the Templeton estate closed. That wasn't necessarily suspicious on its own. Small appraisal firms come and go, but I managed to find an old article about the dissolution. The firm's owner, a man named Jeffrey Greenfield, had been sued by the Pennsylvania State Licensing Board for fraudulent appraisals. He'd lost his license and the company shut down shortly after. I felt my stomach clench. The appraisal on the business shares, the one that valued Richard's 40% at just $200,000, had been done by a company whose owner was later found to be conducting fraudulent appraisals. That couldn't be coincidence. I spent my lunch hour in one of the small conference rooms, door closed, going through the photos on my phone again and making detailed notes. The more I looked at the documents, the more the pattern became clear. Lawrence had systematically undervalued assets, inflated debts, and used legal mechanisms to redirect money that should have been split between him and Dennis. All of it was technically legal, in the sense that the proper forms had been filed and the proper procedures followed. But if the underlying valuations were fraudulent, if the signatures were forged or obtained under false pretenses, then the entire estate distribution was fraud. The question was how to prove it. That night, I stayed late again. Dennis didn't show up until around 10:30, pushing his cleaning cart down the hallway. When he saw me still at my desk, he changed direction and came over. "You look like you've been hit by a truck," he said. "Did you find something?" I gestured for him to come into the office, closed the door, and showed him my notes. Dennis read through them slowly, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he looked up at me. I knew it. I always knew something was wrong with those appraisals, with those valuations, but I could never prove it. "The appraisal company was fraudulent," I said. "That's a start. If we can prove the business shares were deliberately undervalued, that opens up questions about everything else." "What about the signatures?" Dennis asked, pointing to my notes about the agreement waiving his rights to the business shares. "I never signed that. I swear to you, Michael, I have no memory of ever signing anything like that." "Are you sure?" I asked. "Because false memory is a real thing, and this was 20 years ago. Because the signature looks authentic to me, and if it went to a handwriting analysis, I'm not sure we could prove forgery." Dennis shook his head firmly. "I'm sure. I would never have waived my rights to Dad's business. Never. That company meant everything to him. Lawrence knew I would have fought for those shares. That's why he had to forge the document." "Then we need to prove it," I said. "Which means we need a handwriting expert, which means we need money, which we don't have." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us staring at my notes like they'd suddenly reveal a solution. Then Dennis said, Dennis said. Something clicked in my mind. Dennis asked, quote, 86. I thought about that. Quote, 87. Quote, 88. I made a note to search for neurologists in Pennsylvania who practiced 20 years ago. It was a long shot, but medical records might still exist somewhere. We talked for another hour, going through the list Dennis had given me, discussing each item, trying to figure out what could be proven and what was just suspicion. By the time Dennis had to continue his cleaning rounds, we had a plan, sort of. I would keep digging through firm files, looking for more inconsistencies. Dennis would try to remember any other details about the estate, any conversations he'd had with his father or mother, anything that might be useful. Over the next 2 weeks, I became obsessed. I came in early every morning, before anyone else, and spent an hour in the archives before starting my actual work. I stayed late every night after everyone else left, and used the firm's legal research databases to investigate. I found more suspicious details. The LLC that bought the property, the one that had paid $450,000, had been registered just 2 months before the purchase. The listed owner was Harold Sterling, Lawrence's business partner, the same Harold Sterling whose name was on the firm letterhead. Sterling had bought the property, held it for 6 months, then sold it for $700,000, a $250,000 profit in 6 months. That property had been grossly undervalued in the estate sale. I found articles about Templeton Sterling Industrial's eventual sale. The company had been sold in 2006 for $12 million. Richard's original 40% stake, if it had been held until the sale, would have been worth nearly $5 million. Instead, it had been appraised at $200,000 and transferred entirely to Lawrence. The numbers were staggering. I started building a spreadsheet, calculating how much Dennis had actually been owed versus how much he'd received. My conservative estimate put it at around $3 million he'd been cheated out of. $3 million. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the spreadsheet, when someone knocked on my door. I looked up and saw Philip standing in the doorway. "Working late as usual," he said. There was something in his tone, something off. Just finishing up some research, I said, minimizing the window with the spreadsheet. Merger agreement's almost done. Right, the merger agreement. Philip stepped into my office, closed the door behind him. Michael, I need to ask you something. Have you been accessing archived files lately? My mouth went dry. Sometimes. For research. Why? Which files? Philip asked, and his voice was casual, but his eyes were sharp. Just curious. I shrugged, trying to keep my voice steady. Various cases. Depends on what I'm working on. Philip sat down in the chair across from my desk. Because I got a call from archives saying someone's been pulling estate files from 20 years ago. Old cases, closed cases, cases that have nothing to do with any active work. That wouldn't be you, would it? My heart was hammering. I might have pulled a few files. I was researching something for my own understanding, learning about how estate work is handled. Is that a problem? Depends on what you're researching, Philip said. Depends on why you're researching it. I met his eyes, trying to look confused rather than terrified. I don't understand. Am I not supposed to use the archives for research? You're not supposed to use firm resources for personal matters, Philip said. And you're definitely not supposed to be investigating cases involving senior partners. That's a very fast way to end your career, Michael. Do you understand what I'm saying? He knew. Somehow, he knew. I forced my expression to stay neutral. I was just trying to learn. I didn't realize there were restrictions on which files I could access for educational purposes. Philip stood up. There aren't restrictions, officially, but there are unwritten rules. And one of those rules is that you don't dig into the senior partner's old cases unless you're specifically assigned to do so. Consider this a friendly warning. Focus on your actual work. Forget whatever you've been researching. It's not worth your career. He left, closing the door behind him. I sat frozen at my desk for a long time after he was gone, trying to process what had just happened. Someone in archives must have noticed me pulling the Templeton estate files and reported it, which meant Lawrence probably knew I was looking into his brother's case, which meant I was in serious trouble. My phone buzzed. A text from Dennis. Quote, 108. I texted back. Quote, 109. That night, Dennis was waiting for me in the copy room. He looked agitated, nervous. He said, I asked. Dennis's hands were shaking. He was nice about it, Michael. That's what made it scary. He wasn't threatening. He was just explaining, very reasonably, that you're going to lose everything if you keep helping me, and that it would be my fault. I felt a chill. He's trying to isolate you, make you think you're the problem. Aren't I? Dennis asked. I am the problem. I am dragging you into this. Philip warned you off, didn't he? They're going to fire you, Michael. Or worse, Lawrence has connections everywhere. He could destroy your career before it even starts. He could. I agreed. But I'm not stopping. Dennis looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Quote, 120. Quote, 21, I said. Quote, 22. Quote, 23, Dennis said quietly. Quote, 124. Quote, 25, I said. Quote, 126. Dennis looked like he might cry. Quote, 127. Quote, 128, I said. Quote, 129. Quote, 130, Dennis asked. I'd been thinking about this since my conversation with Philip. Like the State Bar Association. Like an investigator who specializes in legal ethics violations. Like maybe even the FBI, if we can prove the fraud was substantial enough. Dennis's eyes widened. I said, we stood in the copy room, surrounded by machines and cleaning supplies, and I saw the moment Dennis truly understood what I was proposing. Not just a lawsuit to recover assets, not just a complaint to the bar, a criminal investigation into one of the most prominent lawyers in the state. Quote, 135, he asked. Quote, 136. I thought about it, really thought about it, about what it would mean for my career, for my life, for my future. Then I thought about Lawrence Templeton walking past his brother in the hallway, ignoring the man whose life he'd destroyed, secure in the knowledge that he'd gotten away with it. Quote, 137, I said. Quote, 138. The next morning, I called in sick to work. First sick day I'd taken since starting at the firm. Then I got in my car and drove 3 hours to Pittsburgh, to the headquarters of the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. I'd made an appointment under a fake name, said I had information about financial crimes. They gave me a slot at 2 p.m. with an investigator named Allison Crane. Investigator Crane was in her 40s, sharp-eyed, with gray streaks in her dark hair, and the demeanor of someone who'd heard every lie and excuse imaginable. We met in a small conference room with cinderblock walls and fluorescent lights. Quote 139, she said, sitting across from me. Quote 140, I opened my laptop, pulled up the spreadsheet I'd built, and started explaining. I walked her through the entire case. The estate distribution, the fraudulent appraisals, the suspicious property sale, the insurance policy modifications, the business shares. I showed her the documents I'd photographed, the valuations, the signatures, the timeline. I explained how Dennis had been systematically cut out of his inheritance by his own brother, a prominent attorney who'd used his legal expertise to commit fraud. Investigator Crane listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally. When I finished, she sat back and looked at me. You work at Templeton and Sterling, she said. It wasn't a question. She asked, I said. Investigator Crane studied me for a long moment. Quote, 148. Quote, 149, I asked. She smiled slightly. Quote, 150. Quote, 151, I said. Quote, 152. Investigator Crane raised an eyebrow. Quote, 153. Quote, 154, I said. Quote, 155. Quote, 156. I thought about Dennis cleaning offices at 1 a.m. while his brother's name hung in gold letters 1 floor above. Yeah, I said. I'm prepared. Investigator Crane nodded slowly. All right, I'll start the preliminary investigation. Give me contact information for you and for Dennis Templeton. And Michael, watch your back. Men like Lawrence Templeton don't go down easy. I drove back to the city that evening, knowing I'd just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. I went straight home, didn't go to the office. Around 8 p.m., my phone rang. Philip. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. Michael, you need to call me back immediately. We need to discuss your employment status. I called Dennis instead, told him what I'd done, what I'd set in motion. There was silence on the other end of the line for a long time. Then, thank you. Jesus Christ, Michael, thank you. Don't thank me yet, I said. It's going to get worse before it gets better. It did get worse. Much worse. I showed up to work the next morning and found my access card didn't work. The security guard in the lobby informed me that my employment had been terminated, effective immediately. My personal items would be mailed to me. I wasn't to contact anyone at the firm or enter the building. On what grounds? I asked. The guard shrugged. I just work here, man. They didn't tell me. I called Philip. He answered on the first ring. You're fired, Michael. Gross misconduct, violation of confidentiality agreements, misuse of firm resources, clean termination, no severance. Don't bother applying for unemployment because we'll fight it. And don't even think about suing because you signed an arbitration agreement when you started. I didn't violate any confidentiality, I said. I disclosed information about potential criminal activity. That's protected. Good luck proving that, Philip said. Lawrence Templeton has more lawyers than you have brain cells. You just threw away your career for a con artist who's been feeding you lies about his poor, victimized life. I hope it was worth it. He hung up. I stood on the sidewalk outside the Garrison building, unemployed for the first time since law school, and felt a strange sense of calm. I'd known this was coming. I'd prepared for it. What I hadn't prepared for was the letter that arrived 3 days later. A cease and desist from Templeton and Sterling's legal team, demanding I return all documents related to the firm's cases, that I refrain from making any public statements about the firm or its partners, and that I cease all communication with Dennis Templeton. Failure to comply would result in legal action for breach of contract, theft of proprietary information, and defamation. The letter was signed by Lawrence Templeton himself. I called Investigator Crane. She said. I admitted. Quote 175. Over the next 3 months, that's what I did. I wrote everything down. Every conversation with Dennis, every file I'd accessed, every discovery I'd made. I sat for hours in Investigator Crane's office, going through documents, answering questions, helping her understand the complexity of the fraud. She brought in forensic accountants who confirmed what I'd suspected. The property had been grossly undervalued. The business shares had been worth far more than the appraisal indicated. The estate had been systematically looted. She found the neurologist who'd treated Clara Templeton, Dr. Raymond Fisher, now retired, confirmed that Clara had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease 6 months before Richard's death. He provided medical records showing clear cognitive decline. Those records established that Clara likely didn't have capacity to understand the insurance beneficiary changes she'd supposedly signed. The handwriting expert Crane hired examined the waiver document, the one where Dennis had supposedly given up his rights to the business shares. She found inconsistencies in the signature, pressure patterns that suggested possible forgery, though she couldn't definitively prove it without the original document. But combined with everything else, the pattern was damning. In month 4 of the investigation, Investigator Crane called me. "We're filing charges: wire fraud, fraud on the court, exploitation of an incapacitated person. The Attorney General is holding a press conference tomorrow. You should probably stay away from your apartment for a few days. This is going to be all over the news." She was right. The press conference exploded across every news outlet in Pennsylvania. Prominent attorney charged with defrauding brother. Lawrence Templeton accused of estate fraud. The details were everywhere: the undervalued assets, the forged signatures, the exploitation of a mother with dementia. Lawrence's reputation, built over 30 years, collapsed in a single news cycle. The Pennsylvania Bar Association suspended his license pending investigation. Templeton and Sterling issued a statement distancing the firm from Lawrence's personal actions. Harold Sterling, the other name on the letterhead, quietly retired and was never charged, though the investigation revealed he'd been complicit in the property scheme. I watched the news from a hotel room, Dennis sitting next to me. We didn't celebrate. We just sat there, watching a man's career implode on television, feeling something between vindication and exhaustion. Dennis asked, quote, 180. I said, quote, 181. It took 2 years, 2 years of depositions, hearings, motions. Lawrence hired the best criminal defense team money could buy. They argued statute of limitations. They argued that the valuations had been reasonable at the time. They argued that Dennis had been properly informed of all estate matters and had chosen not to object. They painted Dennis as a drug addict, as an unreliable narrator, as a con artist, manufacturing a case out of old family resentments. They painted me as a vengeful employee, as someone with a grudge against the firm. The trial lasted 6 weeks. I testified for 2 days. Dennis testified for 3. Investigator Crane presented the forensic evidence, the medical records, the financial analysis. The defense attorneys tore into everything, questioned every assumption, highlighted every inconsistency. The jury deliberated for 5 days. I wasn't there when the verdict came in. Dennis called me, his voice shaking. Guilty on all counts. Lawrence Templeton was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. He was disbarred. He was ordered to pay restitution to Dennis in the amount of $4.3 million, the calculated value of what had been stolen, plus interest. Dennis cried when he told me. Not tears of joy exactly. Tears of relief, of vindication, of grief for everything that had been lost. I never thought I'd see this day, he said. I really didn't think anyone would ever believe me. I believed you, I said, because you were telling the truth. The restitution took another year to collect. Lawrence's assets were seized, his house sold, his retirement accounts emptied. Dennis eventually received about $3.2 million, less than he'd been owed, but more than he'd ever imagined getting. He paid off debts, bought a small house, set up a modest retirement fund. He stopped working as a janitor. He started volunteering at a legal aid clinic, helping other people navigate estate disputes. Last I heard, he was doing okay. As for me, I never practiced law again. The Pennsylvania Bar dragged its feet on my application for full licensure, citing the ethical complications of my investigation. Eventually, I withdrew the application. I work as a paralegal now, at a small firm that specializes in whistleblower cases. The pay is terrible compared to what I would have made at Templeton and Sterling, but the work feels right. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So, subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.